the median age of the Canadian worker is 43 years old, the median age. We are an old country when it comes to workforce. My first attraction to linguistics was because I was interested, I'm part Maya, so I was interested in hieroglyph decipherment and these kinds of things. So sometimes we should be mindful of what we do and what we say because it can be very consequential. But sometimes change comes from just pointing someone in the right direction.
Within my circle that I've seen a couple of people from the diplomats, they begin their career as diplomat and then at some point they quit and then they start something of their own with the vision of helping the diplomat families, supporting them in some way or the other way. But maybe that is not a bad idea for some who really want.
I know a couple of them that work for service officers are now real estate agents, because they understand that when you're coming from overseas, you need a home and you don't have a lot of time to find it sometimes. Or when you're leaving, sometimes you need to sell your property. And they understand the concerns of foreign service officers and they specialize in that clientele. So I never use their services, but I know they're there and they're well known. And they were both, they're a couple, they both served overseas and I think for 10 years before calling quits and going back to Canada. So yes, there is that sort of, if you like, indirect result of the multiple roles and the need to adapt and finally coming to the realization that no, this is just too demanding for what I'm prepared to give. So maybe I need to redefine my priorities and go back home. And so many of them, they understand that. Some of them do psychological counseling, others do coaching, others do, like I said, real estate. Others are more into, customs brokers. They know to specialize in shipments and all that. But there's a whole side industry of former employees that do want to help and at the same time developing their own businesses if they can.
Becoming an entrepreneur after being a former diplomat.
Why not? That's great. Some of them might not have known that they were good entrepreneurs before going to the service, because then they realize that they have a lot of abilities to be self-reliant. Well, they apply that when they go home. And again, that's when we talk diplomats, we also talk about, in our case, concretely, we talk about members of the military who have the same pressures, police forces who are also stationed overseas have the same pressures, members of provincial delegations who are housed at the embassies who are also the same pressures. There's various additional types of rotational employees that are not federally appointed, but they're also part of the rotational service, and they face the same constraints. And so we're talking more than the core service here.
Interesting. I think definitely a need to do a research in this section, and if it is done, I think the results will probably help. I think the government itself, right?
Well, I'm just putting the finishing touches to an article that is going to come up at the end of the month, the Canadian Journal of Counseling, and I laid out a number of policy measures that you can implement right away if you want to, that do not mean extra money, do not mean the seeking of extra authorities, do not mean statutory changes. All that they need is a policy change and a couple of memos, and you can implement them right away. And almost all of them will not require new resources, will not require new people, they will not require, can be handled out of the existing resources. Why do I know that? Because for 12 years I drafted policy documents. So for 12 years I did estimates for costing. I know when you need new people, when you don't need it. I know how much it costs per full-time unit. I know where you can go and get it. I know that there are certain parts of the budget you can get it in April. Other parts you want to look for them in October. You just need to write up a couple of memos saying, from now on, we are going to expand this interpretation into this. From now on, we're going to create this section out of the existing section. From now on, people who come back to country are going to go through this process. It's not rocket science. But if I'm for the not doing that, but for simplifying things, for facilitating, for being smarter rather than being, tied to a narrow idea of what it is to implement certain measures, then yes, There's lots of things that can be done that do not require any new or any. It just requires that you look at it from a different angle, and that's what people talk about innovation. They always talk about innovation as if innovation means inventing new things. No, oftentimes innovating means just looking at things from a different angle, and that's why it's important that when I write, for instance, just as an example, sometimes you work with really great editors because this editor really sees things from a different angle, and they're going to propose ideas. They're going to say, why don't you add this? Why don't you take that? How about this? And so you have that dialogue, and what you write becomes so much better. Now, sometimes you have an editor that doesn't care. It's like, whatever, I just put it there. Sometimes you're going to have an editor that thinks that controlling your thinking is the way to produce good copy. No, that's not how it goes. It's not about control. It's about dialogue, right? So when you find that balance, you can innovate a lot. I'm not inventing new words or new music. I'm just looking at things in a different angle. So if people in the high levels or whatever, wherever they are willing to look at these things from a different angle, then you'll be amazed how much easier a lot of the problems that we're having now will become. And a lot of the bottlenecks that we have now will disappear. A lot of things will be much easier. Not everything will be fixed, but a lot of it will be fixed. The one key issue that would not be fixed is, for instance, in my case, I have a permanent appointment in the public service, but I had to take a leave of absence to join my spouse. And I'm not able to contribute to the pension, to my pensionable years, even though I was required to leave my post. I didn't do it by choice. I couldn't do telework because my work would not allow me to do it. So I was required to put in the request for that pay, but I cannot ask, the government will not put in my years of pensionable service, even though the choice I was given was basically destroy my relationship with my spouse or we'll go with her. Because that's really what it comes down to, right? Well, I'm going to stay home. Sorry, you can go to a place that is 12, 15 hours ahead in the clock, but sure, but I'm going to keep my job. Is that realistic to ask of anybody? But that's exactly the mindset the government has. So instead of agreeing to cover those years of pensionable service when you are overseas on orders of the same government, i.e., the same employer, they're like, no. So I have to find a way to cover those years towards my pension out of my own pocket. So that's an issue that was identified as far back as 1981 and still is not resolved. And it doesn't require a change in, the legislation. It's just a couple of things that have to be fixed and amended. It's a simple thing that can be done. Well, I mean, at most there may be 1,000 employee spouses overseas who are on leave without pay currently, at most. So this change will not affect a whole lot of people. And so, you could even put a provision, if you like, that if the government put into your pensionable service this many years when you were overseas, that you're required to go back and work for the same amount of years afterwards. Okay, fine. They gave me 5 years out of pensionable. I got to go back and do another 5 years when I go back. Sure. But I'm going to have 10 years of pensionable service, not 5. So that's the kind of thing. And when you're 22, of course that doesn't matter. When you're 52, that matters a great deal.
Yeah.
And let's not forget that the median age of the Canadian worker is 43 years old. The median age. We are an old country when it comes to workforce. So at that age, 5 years that you lose in pensionable service matter a great deal. And beyond, of course. Yeah. So that's a core issue that has never been addressed. But
do you think that is within the different countries? I mean, all the states are in the same?
Oh, no. I'm pretty sure that other countries have much more. Like I said, in the case of the U.S., I think they have much more friendly policies in that area, and because they have different branches and different kinds of line departments also represented overseas, then I think that they have, and they have their military, which is also quite large. I think they have a number of options available to them that are not available to us. And I think that the Europeans also have other measures. There is a Journal of European Diplomatic Studies, I think, that mentions some of those measures. I'm not fully conversant in them, but I would be very surprised if places like Denmark, Sweden, Finland, or Norway did not have full compensatory measures for the spouses of diplomats that go overseas. Those countries have always led the way in social welfare measures. I would be very surprised if they didn't have way more advanced and much more complete suite of measures to support the spouses of diplomats than what we have. Yeah. And again, why now we don't know that? Because there are no comparative studies. The Canadian government has never wanted to do a comparative study because, of course, it wouldn't be in their interest. It's light years ahead in regards to being concerned about the well-being of the family unit, not just the employee when they're posted overseas. So, that's, I don't see, if I'm wrong, and maybe somebody can put it in the comments, but I have not seen a detailed comparative study on those measures, particularly the policy measures. I haven't seen any of that. And look, there's people going to tell you that there's some premiums that you get for, there's this called foreign service premium, but those were supposed to attract people because the market was not attracting, the market rate salary was not attractive. So those measures were supposed to compensate for either cost of living, like we have here, or to attract for deficiencies in the market they were not meant to be your salary. In practice, those so-called premiums becoming part of your salary, and you use it for your salary. And yeah, there's people going to tell you, oh yeah, your kids can go to school overseas, but the reality is that these compensatory measures have become really minimal compensatory measures, and are in no way an incentive for people to stay. Those of us who remain is because we actually care, and we think that there's a place for us to serve, and that's what we're doing. There's those who start who are also optimistic, and they think, I'm just starting my career, and I'm sure things will change. Rest assured, if nothing is done, things will be exactly the same 20 years from now. Let's not harbor any illusions about change that's not going to come unless it's actually created, that change. So, there's people who are in the middle of their careers that say, well, it's too late for me to change. I'm already halfway there, so maybe just the other half. Some of them might decide, well, I'm going to go home and just stop being a rotational employee. I'm just going to join the public service and stay in Canada. Others might decide I had enough of this, and I'm going to have my own business, whatever. A whole range of choices that are as much imposed by the circumstances created by the conditions in which we have to be posted, and as much as by personal life conditions that some people might have issues. Like, for instance, I was at the UN when the pandemic started. I was in Afghanistan, but I have asthma, right? So at that time, COVID, nobody knew if it was going to be a serious pulmonary disease. So I lost my job because I could no longer be posted overseas, because of that. Well, I had to go back home and reinvent myself. And what I decided was, like I said before, well, I always wanted to learn about information science, how people manage to learn and who use the information, particularly young people who were born in more digital environments than I was. Now I went back to school and I retooled and got my master's. I enjoyed that. But if I had not been forced to leave, I would still be deployed in another position, in another country. This is not a choice that was something that came from me. It came from without. It came from because of external forces. And a lot of these choices that people make in this kind of environment is either because the employer's narrow ideas or obtuseness, or because of the stage of their lives in which they find themselves, or other responsibilities. The choices they make is because they have very few options.
I think this happens also on the corporate side as well sometimes, that you are in fact indeed the external forces to move you in a direction which is not what you want. So yeah, this happens in.
Yeah, that was in Trinidad. I saw people getting fired left, right, and center from the oil industry
Yeah.
because oil dropped. And but then they're like, okay, well, it's going to come back in 3 to 5 years, and I just want to make sure I'm there. And sure enough, it comes back, and they're rehired because it's a cyclical industry that goes up and down. So yeah, they kind of come to expect that, but they immediately get to go home. Again, that's a choice also that I made. I'm not necessarily interested in going the corporate route, but if you are in the corporate route and you manage your finances well, I think that you do not have to fear unemployment or certain changes in your life because you can have a cushion that could help you, right? Which is not the case. And if you're a public servant, you lose your job, you lose your job. That's the end of that. Maybe you'll get a pension if you have some years of service. Most likely you won't because you don't have enough years of service. So, hence the need to reinvent, to assume a new role, to look for other opportunities, like we have to in some circumstances. But again, this should not be because of the narrow constraints that the employer places on people on spousal employability or career choices or life overseas. I think people will always have difficulties, but if there are mechanisms to support people as they transition, it will be a lot easier to deal with these life circumstances than it is currently the case.
It's interesting because I think I always thought the government jobs are far more secure. The privileges, especially as a diplomat, what you get is also much more than an expat family, let's say.
And that goes to the old days, right? There were those advantages way back, maybe 20 years ago. Those things are gone now. Now people really, at least in the Canadian service, you get your salary and some premiums, and that's the end of that. There's no any extras. No. Whatever you pay for school, what the school charges goes directly. You don't, you submit a budget and the government will pay the school of your kid, but that doesn't mean the government is going to pay the extracurricular activities, of which there are many. The problem, government, I'm pretty sure is the reality is no. So that comes out of the parents' pockets.
Mm.
And so that's part of a lifestyle level because in these schools overseas, naturally the kind of student that goes tends to be, if you're a corporate kid, of course you're going to have more resources than a non-corporate kid. And so they have to address that as well. So it is a reality, again, an imposed reality because it's not something that people seek, but it is because there's no comparable standards of schooling across countries. There are very few countries that have the same system worldwide. Maybe the French schools, the German schools, they have that. But if a Canadian diplomat whose first language is French wants to be in the French language system, they have to start from the age of 3 or 4 and do the lycée system through the entire progression, all the way to the end of the lycée, because there's no other way to enter that system. So when they go overseas, anywhere, they have to go to a place where there is a lycée. So the people that come here it's called the International French School, but it is the lycée, is the equivalent. So the Francophone parents place the children there. There is no choice about that. So the employee has to assume those costs. When they go back to Ottawa, there is a lycée français that's separate, and they have to go to that lycée français, even though it's a private school, because that's the only comparable standard. Again, not by choice, but because there are no options.
Also,
Yeah, that happens, and the Japanese always have their children by and large in Japanese schools. So do the Germans. The American system is worldwide, so there's a number of schools that basically teach to the U.S. curriculum, and so you can find that in a lot of countries, and that's where many parents tend to gravitate, uh, particularly those who are thinking of perhaps sending their children to do university studies in the U.S. or in Canada.
I think I've come across as well some Korean expats living in India. What they do is have their kids go to international school, which is the British school, and then come back home and also study the Korean curriculum
Mm-hmm.
because they want to make sure when the kids go back in Korea, they are in sync with the
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah,
that means that the kid is learning like twice,
two
right?
systems.
Yeah, two
They're
systems.
then two systems and two sets of competencies, because whatever is valued as a competency in Korea might not be valued at all in the UK.
So that is one factor that, okay, I don't know, many expats understand that, but it's interesting to know that Korean culture, the curriculum, the education is so strict that it's like French as well, like the French as well, when they're
Yeah, it's the same thing, very structured,
very
very,
structured.
very rigid.
They cannot think of going outside their Korean
No,
curriculum.
no, there's no outside the box in that area. I think that the French tests results used to be graded in Paris. I'm not sure they still are, but it used to be the case that the schools overseas had to send the test to Paris for
Mm.
grading. So it's that kind of centralized power. It's heavily, heavily centralized.
Well, oh, I want to understand, you had a shift from linguistics to education policy. Was it your decision to move, or was it also something, an external forced move that you moved from linguistics to education policy? How
Well,
did
my first attraction to linguistics was because I was interested. I'm part Maya, so I was interested in hieroglyph decipherment and these kinds of things. So understanding the linguistic parts of any language is it's key to decipher any kind of other language that haven't been fully deciphered. So that was my first interest, and I also at the time. The concept of artificial intelligence at the done. We did not use those words. We used words like automaton or robot or Turing machines, but that was essentially what we were working with
yeah.
to work in decipherment, and that was kind of my passion. But it's I found that it was a field that it was too narrow in the sense that it didn't take into account the human aspect. Yeah, they talk about languages, but it was you might as well have been talking about paper cups. There was no human element to that. There was no human creativity in that kind of linguistics. And so I thought, language is more than that. Language is more than just coming up for the replicating structures and finding out some kind of keys and open these with these keys open certain other uh, artifacts or elements. It's about people, and people have other host of other issues and needs. And so I took a course in sociolinguistics, and that really expanded my understanding of what it was, what we call language. And so it also made me understand the way in which we as humans shape the language and how language shapes us. And that's what made me think, this is a much more broader field than what I was doing. And I stepped away from that technical stuff, which I liked. I mean, it was fun to fill up, you know, place blackboard with formulas and stuff and derivations and whatnot. Yeah, it was great, but that wasn't really all that it was. And so as I was expanding my understanding of what language is and the forces that shape language, then I understood the way in which education plays a role, which can be educated in many ways. They can be educated in the neighborhood by talking to people who live in the neighborhood. They can also be educated at school by receiving a certain kind of training. They can also be educated by their workplaces by receiving additional forms of training. And all of that shapes the way they think, the way they interact with others, the way they perceive themselves in the world. And that led me to, understanding the links between learning and language. And learning happens a lot in the context of traditional education structures, such as the ones that you and I attended. So that learning also has elements of violence in it. In other words, the school environment is violent towards us as kids. It does violence to us because of their structural constraints and because of the way it can perceive us as either people who need to be nurtured and encouraged or people who can basically be discarded, who will have no opportunities. And so I saw that schools were the ideal environment also to reproduce the injustices and the inequities and the inequalities that are in society at large.
Yeah.
So language manifests all of that in all those levels of inequity and inequality in the way in which we use it. If you're a lawyer, you use the language in a very different way.
Yeah.
Somehow, whatever you put on that contract has the power of magic, and somehow you have to follow that to the letter, even though it is written in a way that few of us can understand. But that's how it is. If you look at what you have to sign away when you use Facebook or any app, you have to sign away a whole bunch of rights, and they say, "Well, do you agree?" Well, if you don't agree, you cannot use it.
That's true.
And there's pages and pages and pages of things that nobody reads, but our lawyers wrote it, no doubt, with the idea of protecting that corporate issue and making money as much as possible of that. Well, some of that might be quite laudable, some of that may be quite important, whatever, intellectual property and all that. Some of it might be just opportunistic, some of that may be just predatory behavior, who knows? Because we're not part of that universe. But it's the same language in theory. So that led me these the different ways in which people learn, and I wanted to understand what's the landscape upon which learning takes place, and the landscape is a policy landscape, and that's where decisions are made, and those decisions have far-reaching consequences, even when the people who make those decisions do not realize that.
With the policies, then you also then moved on to the food security program. So
Yeah.
and there you use, I think, some technology, right? There was some learning outcomes that wherein you were founder of some program. Could you talk us about that?
Well, the thing was that to you and I, the idea of children not going hungry to school is clear. It's fundamental, and it's self-evident. But to many organizations, including some in the international arena, the idea of tying learning outcomes to nutritional interventions is something strange, because that's nutrition is the Ministry of Health and learning is Ministry of Education. So the two of them cannot go together. So what we did was to put them together and have a program that dealt with providing nutritionally valuable, locally produced meals in local schools with their projected client base of 11 million children and their families. Because guess what? If those kids go to school hungry, they're not going to learn anything.
Yeah.
If those kids go hungry, if they are part of a rural household, they're not even going to be able to help in the fields if they're hungry. But if they go to school and they get a good meal, and they're going to get a learning there, and then they're going to be able to go back home with another good meal, well, that's 2 out of 3. And in poor households, that might be all they get. So that nutritional intervention, to link that with learning outcomes required a sort of a bridge, right? Mm-hmm. And how to use information to infer that naturally children who had nutritional value and nutritional interventions were more likely to perform better in school than children who didn't. And of course, you're not going to perform an experiment there where you basically deprive children from food in one group and then put the other children, because that would be not only inhumane, immoral, all of that stuff. Although, by the way, that has been done in the past in other countries. There's the Guatemala project that Emory University did. It was quite along those lines. But anyway, go back to this discussion at hand. What we wanted to do was to find a way of finding an evaluation indicator that stood for the nutrition intervention as an indicator of learning outcomes. And in fact, it was easy to demonstrate. But children were well fed. They were able to assimilate the content, and their performance was increased much more than the case before the program was introduced. Before that, there was very little or next to nothing academic achievement. Once the nutritional intervention was introduced, well, if you isolate this and you say it's the same like with smoking, right? Nobody knew that smoking was directly caused by the cause of cancer because they hadn't found the genetic alteration. A few years ago, they found it, but for decades, people knew the only thing that gives you this is smoking. You remove smoking, you know that it goes away. Well, if you remove nutritional interventions from people's learning ability, they're going to go hungry into school. If they're hungry, then they're going to learn. If you add that and keep everything else the same, voila. So for that, we develop a series of instruments You can develop a little app that you can track people where they were going and where they're coming to school, back up from the school, so that we could demonstrate that they were not going to get food on the road or some other place, where they could contaminate the results. Because, of course, first of all, there was nowhere to eat between school and home for many of these kids. But secondly, people would ask to demonstrate, well, are you sure they did not get other sources? Fine. So within that, we were able to sort of track those kinds of beneficiary issues and really isolate the fact that, yeah, nutrition interventions are critical. If you feed your children, they're going to learn. If you don't, they won't. So that was kind of again, it's innovation in the sense that I was looking at things that to me were quite obvious, but for other people, and particularly people in the bureaucracies of the ministry's concern, was not, because it's like, no, I only deal with health, and no, I only deal with education. Well, guys, you need to look at these things as a complementary approach. You cannot look at a child as 20% education, 20% health, 20% this. No, it's the totality. And so by working together, by coordinating your actions, you get better results. And in the end, it might even be cheaper for you. So that to change that kind of thinking, that's the innovative part, if you like. To say to make people understand that yes, you can. If you look at this from this perspective, if you look at hunger as a fundamental element in lack of learning outcomes, then you can see where your solution is. And if you look at learning in isolation of how your children eat, well, then you're not going to be able to understand why is it that learning is not taking place.
Yeah. I think what I see that you've used the technology as well, right, in this program, not just so you blend education, the policy, and then
Yes.
you created the app. There wasn't learning.
There was a learning app, but there was also a mapping exercise for food security and resilience that was done in the entire country. And that exercise happens all the time. But what I did that was different is to put emphasis on the schools areas and relate that to areas where you could find locally produced food, so that you can actually get the schools closer to the areas where the food will be produced.
This was done in the difficult locations, right? This
in the border with Afghanistan and Iran. Yeah, these were areas where of difficult access, of difficult climate change conditions as well, because there's climate change issues there. So you have to find also foodstuffs that were resilient. You have to understand how the food supply chain works in those areas, because of course there's food that goes to market, food that goes to export, food that goes locally. So you kind of need to learn logistics in that sense. And believe me, I'm no logistics expert in any sense of the word, but we had some very excellent logistics experts who were leading the way in those areas, and from whom I learned a great deal about the complexities of the food chain.
And for this particular program, you received an award, the Global Service Award.
No, that was the University of Toronto that gave me the Distinguished Alumni Service Award for all the work that I've done overseas. This is for the entire of my career, and all the different countries I worked in, and all the programs. So this was part of it, but it wasn't the only reason. Yeah, but I was very happy to be considered by my peers to be someone who could get that award. Normally they give you a lifetime award when you're about to die, but in this case it wasn't like that. It was like more like here. So I was very happy to have been honored with this award, and that just motivates me more to do more things in the future.
Yeah. I think any kind of recognition, and especially for the impact that you have done and shown, I think it must feel good. And I see that you dedicated that award to your mama. Can you talk?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Because I think in an article that I came across that you have mentioned your mama was
Well,
also.
Mama has been there for 20 years, so that's more than that now, 21 years. So anyway, so yeah, but it's the influence, right? It's the tree under whose shade you grow, right? And even if they cut the tree, you grew up under the shade, so you still have that. So that's why I did that. It was just to stand in for all the women in my life that have had influence. It's just not just her, it's all the other people too, but who have had that sort of impact on me. And so I thought, if it was one person, then she would be the one. She was also a school teacher, back in the day, and I don't think she ever thought I would end up doing the kind of stuff that I'm doing today. But there you have it. Like I said, I was destined to do other very different things than the things that I ended up doing, and all that took was for me to change the environment and embrace the unexpected, and here I am.
Well, and with so many multiple things that you've done, you've also done a radio show in Los Angeles, and that was for focusing on the gang prevention for immigrant families.
Yeah, as you know, in California, that's a big problem, especially in communities like the Hispanic communities, of Mexican descent, and other ethnic groups, and that's been a long standing issue, basically fueled by poverty and lack of opportunities, and a school system that has really fallen more and more behind, especially the public schools. So I was contacted by psychologist, community psychologist there, Nidia Diaz, who has had her show for many years in the KLYC, a community radio station that broadcasts in AM. Because, as you know, AM does not require anything other than a basic radio to be heard. I mean, it doesn't require satellite, doesn't require internet. AM is the most widely accessible radio band that you can use. So they broadcast in AM, and so they reach most of the Los Angeles, San Fernando, San Joaquin valleys, the surrounding areas. I've never been to LA, but she found me on LinkedIn through networking, and she said, I'm thinking of doing this. Would you like to be my guest? And I was grateful to be invited. And the show was bilingual because some parents would call in Spanish and to ask very specific questions, and their level of English was not sufficient, so we had to address that as well. So I was sitting really in the unique position of providing advice to people I probably will never meet in person, but whose circumstances I understood, and sort of the kinds of pressures they were dealing with, and the levels of violence that is done to them, and that they eventually end up being part of, as if they become or they get in contact with the criminal justice systems, or they end up going to jail and such. So the idea was to prevent that, to develop an approach that will help particularly young adolescent males. We're talking here 12 to 16; those were the critical years, to find other ways of channeling
Mm.
the various societal anger forces that are around them into other activities. And media has some of that, and we were animating those activities. And sometimes there will be quiz shows, and with sometimes will be game shows, because this Los Angeles being Hollywood, all that stuff had to be used. So our show had that sort of element of a variety show, of a talk show, and opinions. Sometimes there were analysis, but there was a whole range of ways of presenting the issues. And I was the regular guest, so I would be there about twice a week.
Okay.
Now LA is 3 hours, 3 or 4 hours behind Ottawa time, depending on the time of the year, which meant that the show there, if her show, Nina show, started at 9 p.m. Pacific time, which meant 3 midnight Ottawa time. So twice a week I would, show up to work looking really tired, and people would think, oh, you were partying all night. And I'm like, yeah, I was good, but because I didn't want to explain that I was actually being part of this show. But it was great. It lasted a good couple of years. It was good.
Yeah, I think that's just something. Wait, did you ever think that you would do it, or was it more like, okay, let me just try something new?
Not at all. Not at all. I had no clue. I had no clue about what producing a show was, or developing a script or having a sound engineer in your thing here and others. I I have no clue. When she asked me, I thought I was going to be, maybe she was going to interview me for like 5 minutes and get a couple of quotes and say, hey, bye. But then she said, like, she started to ask me, do you see similar problems than the ones we have here in LA to the ones that you may have in Toronto or in Montreal or Vancouver? I said, well, in some ways there are, but in other ways are different. And then I started to make the distinctions. And I think that was the moment when she got really interested because I was able to make the comparisons of the issues that were more prevalent in LA and the issues that were not prevalent in Canada. So when she saw that, she figured I knew a bit about the subject matter than maybe she thought at the beginning. Because all she knew me was as a sociologist and policy expert in education. She didn't know that I had actual experience with these issues. So that led to, being invited to a bit more. And then eventually, like I said, twice a week, I was just part of the program. And the whole program, I was there and with my earmuffs and all that. And, while they were working on the studio in LA. So it was definitely not something I ever expected to do. But, it kind of goes back to service, right? I mean, okay, I have some knowledge. This is the best way to distribute that knowledge. A lot of people are listening to it. Well, then this is the way you have to do it.
Yeah. Great. I think you've really had multiple roles like that held and done successful. And I think that experience of, I think the instant connection on a radio show is quite different than any other platform or format.
Yes. And also the fact that people can call anonymously,
Yes,
that
exactly.
gave them a lot of power
Mhm.
because they were asking some really, really delicate questions. Like, my son is a gang leader and, his gang girlfriend is pregnant, but he doesn't want that life. What are we going to do about it? That kind of thing. It was quite something.
It must be heavy. I think, in fact, it's a service, but okay.
It
It's a
was. Well, some days were really, really heavy. Yeah. Or, my child killed somebody. What do we do? That there were some moments where it was quite heavy. Yeah. Very difficult situations.
Okay, so the last segment of the podcast. You've worked with institutions like UN, WFP, Global Affairs Canada. And looking back, what's one project or moment that's left a lasting mark on how you think about purpose and impact?
Oh,
That's a,
that's a hard one because there's several really. It's not just only one.
maybe the, I don't know, top three that you really think, okay, I really keep that in my memory for a longer period.
I think you know on a personal level, my most rewarding moment maybe is to when I when I see people that have been part of our programs and they come up and say, "Yeah, I used to." Like I work in a bilingual education program in early on in my career in southern Mexico, and that was the purpose of that program was to bring uh, education to rural areas using radio. And in the idea that we came up with was to use FM radio to transmit content because FM radio has a really good quality of sound. And we asked the phone companies to lend us space so we could put because FM radio signal can only go facing each other. It doesn't bounce off the atmosphere, so you have to have repeater radio stations for the FM to work. So at least at that time, that was this was before satellites technology and all that. And so we asked the authorities to lend us the space, and they gave it to us. And many years later, I will find people who say, "Yeah, I went to school using the radio system in the peninsula," and they would. And when I would mention that I was one of the people who worked on that, they were like, "Oh yeah, right," give you a hug or whatever. And those moments were really special because it's hard to to see the impact of what you do unless there's, again, a human face, right? And in those moments where there was a human face, that was really super special. Yeah. And it happened for a long time. I went back there 20 years later, and they were still remember that. And I went back to give a couple of papers at a conference, and people who were there, they're like, "Oh, you were the one that were part of that team," and then yeah. So it was feeling that was a unique moment, and that it was quite special for all of us, for sure. Yeah.
I think it's a nice thing to recognize beyond the awards also this way, to receive such a warm welcome.
To me, it felt like I was, I didn't know that it could have any impact. You think in abstract terms, you never think about the impact. But then at that moment, I realized that, many times we have impact on people's lives and we're not even aware of it.
Yeah.
Like I remember when I was going to school, I was taking this course in ancient technologies, how people used to produce different artifacts using ancient technologies. And one of my classmates, she was very keen on taking notes and stuff. And, she always asked me if she missed anything, what did you write? And I thought, well, that's great that you were so interested, but I didn't have the same, let's say, the same level of interest that she had. But I didn't know anything about her other than she had great interest in these areas. And so one day I remember I saw a poster that they were looking for someone who had an interest in, antiquity and ancient technologies for a museum project in Ottawa. And I said to her, "No, look, I saw this poster. Why don't you, I see that you like that stuff. Why don't you apply?" And I'm not sure if it's a summer job or what, but should give it a try. And she's like, "Oh, sure." And I remember she was super keen. I mean, she was very applied and to her studies. And I stopped. That was an optional course that I took in my linguistics program. I never saw her again at all. Well, years later, 10 years later, maybe, I remember attending this event at the National Gallery of Canada. There was this event, some kind of celebration that I had been invited to. It was kind of a formal invitation. And then I see Amanda coming in there, superly attire and all that. And then I really didn't recognize what she did. It's like, oh, and she gave me a big hug and all that. And I'm like, oh, I'm glad to see you. And you're working here now. And she said, let me introduce you to my boss. And, who goes to the big guy, my big man on campus, whoever that was. And he said, I'd like to introduce you to the person who made my career possible. And I'm like, what the hell are you talking about? It turns out that she was a single mom. She had 3 kids at home. She was studying on a scholarship and supporting her kids. And her ambition in life was to work in a class-oriented museum in the area of technology. Like she always was interested in that. And that internship led to a job, which led to another job, and now eventually she became like the director of the place. And all that it took for me was to mention to her that it was this poster. I didn't know that it was going to be so consequential. But I guess I'm saying that to you is that because sometimes we should be mindful of what we do and what we say because it can be very consequential. In the end, it had a lot of impacts because I'm sure that, she was probably helping other people along the way and so on. And she's still working in the field and she's very happy. So change comes in many ways. Right? Change comes in sometimes from these big programs that we do. And people say, yeah, you were part of that original group. We thank you for it, what you did for us. But sometimes change comes from just pointing someone in the right direction.
Yeah, absolutely.
Here we are. Yeah.
I think with this episode, the ones who are watching, they would really get the insights of what the change could do in your life and how to be really quite open to embrace that change in the right way so that you never know, like just like what you could do to that lady, you also could do something really consequential to somebody else and have an impact in life. So your episode is full of impact. The impact of your work, the impact around you, maybe also in your colleagues, in your social circle. And we need to be mindful as to that there's a learning in every corner, and
Yes.
there is no way that you could look into your change, into your life, into your perspective as good or bad, but just to be, to maybe curiously listen and learn. Uh, and I'm really glad that this came to you, and I'm really honored, honestly, Carlos. It's really an honor to have you. And
Likewise.
yes, I think we have not even touched the half of what you have done in your Okay, and this was a masterclass for me, and I'm sure for the audience as well, tuning in to understand the dynamics of his profile, the roles that he has gone through and been successful. So, yeah, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me. This has been a real pleasure for me, and I hope that people can get some use out of it. And remember, it's if things were easy, we would not be where we are. Things are difficult, and we need to understand that it's not just candy. We have to be prepared to have a fair amount of difficulties and challenges, and that's what makes us really able to learn. And what we're sharing here today is really the sum of all the learnings,
Yeah.
which includes fears, which includes aspirations, which includes being sad and being sometimes feeling really at the end of your rope, and sometimes wondering what you can do, if anything at all, and then knowing that there's going to be another day, and we are here to fight another day, and there will be another sunrise tomorrow, and hopefully we'll all be a part of that sunrise.
Yeah, yeah. And I think maybe there's an opportunity as well to have you back on the show for a part two
I
of
will be glad to. Yeah, thank you for
the
thinking of me.
topic.
Yeah,
Yeah,
very happy to. Yeah.
because I think I've not covered, as I said, I have not covered everything. Honestly, in fact, I feel like whatever you have done, what you have been doing, or what you plan to do, I think it needs more
Yeah,
space.
we haven't talked about the theology part yet, but that's another.
Yeah. So there is more to Carlos than just what we discussed today. And that probably, hopefully, we can maybe again do this some other time. But for now, thank you so much,
Thank
Pastor.
you, Xavier, and it's an honor to meet you, and I hope that your audience also will take something home with them, and looking forward to participating in any future conversations.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.